And again, I wish everybody, both here in the room and on Zoom, a Shabbat Shalom. Hope that you and your families are doing well. So last Friday night, I made a more or less parenthetical observation about a relatively new and, to me, really a phenomenal trend in the Jewish world, which is that couples planning to get married are, for the most part, now ordering their own personalized ketubot. There was a time when this option was limited to those who could afford to commission an artist. And that gave rise to a small but beautiful corner of the Jewish art world known as illuminated ketubot. Today, though, thanks to ketubah.com, I kid you not, and other websites from which I receive absolutely no commission, couples can get a beautifully crafted ketubah in the form of a print, pre-filled in with their names and dates and place of the wedding and other required details. Now, their ketubah might not be one of a kind and completely unique, because others can order that one too, but the odds that someone else in a couple's own circle of friends will choose exactly the same design among the many hundreds, if not thousands, that are available is, I think, pretty slim. Now, if you are of a certain age and of the married persuasion, then your ketubah is likely less artistically complicated. I am seeing fewer yellow pamphlet ketubahs coming out of drawers hidden away. Usually they are secured and produced when it is time to figure out the Hebrew names of prior generations. And thankfully, very beautiful color laser printed or precision machine paper cut designs are now hanging on walls of Jewish homes all over the world. And Friday I mentioned a reason that I like this new and relatively inexpensive, believe it or not, ketubah upgrade. I tell couples that when they hang their ketubah on their wall, they will have a reminder any moment they want of a day where their feelings for each other were at a high point for dreams, commitment, romance, hope, and love. To those will be added many other things over years of marriage, not all quite so poetic and optimistic, challenges and stresses of all kinds that you can likely identify with, whether by experience or by observation. But if they look at their ketubah, their founding document, if you will, they might experience a brief return of feelings for and about each other that still exist on some level. A ketubah is not the only founding document we look to for inspiration. With apologies to the Canadians I referenced earlier, I heard a story this week about a copy of the United States Constitution that is going up for auction. Not just any copy. This copy was created at the Constitutional Convention in 1789, and it may have been handled or was certainly in the presence of Washington, Hamilton, Franklin, and others. And a piece of paper, is going to sell for millions of dollars, many times more than when it last changed hands. As a more Jewish thought experiment, could you imagine what a copy of a Torah scroll that Moses or Joshua might have read from would fetch? It would bring new meaning to a word that is often used incorrectly, that word being priceless. Looking at our founding documents for inspiration is an idea we return to this week as we roll the Torah back to the beginning and read as we just did from Parshat Bereshit. Although, as we mentioned, we are now in the third triennial, it is almost impossible to overlook the Torah's opening words. Probably more commentary has been written on the opening chapter of Genesis than on any other. But there is a classic question which relates to the opening words of our Torah, which is, why is this much discussed account of the creation of the universe and the world and everything in it, why is it even in the Torah? Which is such a good question that it is the very first thing that bothers Rashi as he opens his monumentally important Torah commentary. Before I tell you what he teaches, let's dig a little deeper into the nature of the question. Now that we know that the Torah starts with Bereshit bara, it seems obvious that this is where the Torah should start. No one knows the second line of A Tale of Two Cities. Well, no one except English majors. But if Dickens had started with, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, instead of it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, then that would have been seen as the obvious beginning of the book. Now that we know the Torah starts with in the beginning, we have a hard time imagining it starting in any other way. So what's the problem? Well, if you think the Torah is a book mainly for the Jewish people, to lay out our origin, our narrative, our history, laws, and more laws, then you have to wait around quite a while for the Torah to get around to anything other than procreation and circumcision. The opening two Torah portions have nothing to do with Judaism. You could have all of the Jewish tradition, the ups, the downs, the do's, the don'ts, everything the Talmud would need to expand on these written words to make a livable religion. And you could do it all without this week's creation narrative or next week's flood story. The very first line of Rashi's Torah commentary goes even further. Quoting teacher Rabbi Isaac, he says, the Torah could have better started with the first commandment that was issued to the entire Israelite people. Namely, this month shall be to you the beginning of months, which does not appear until Exodus chapter 12. Lop off all of Genesis and 11 chapters of Exodus, and you would still have all you need to form a cogent Torah. So, why does the Torah start here? A few reasons, and within those reasons, hopefully, some lasting lessons. One is that religions typically have creation stories. Narratives of how it all came into being and how their chosen God had a lot, if not everything, to do with it. One of Heschel's less famous quotes is that Jews are just like everyone else, only more so. Which in this context means that if other religions have an account of creation, then we should too. Because if we didn't, people would ask how the world began according to our tradition, and we might not know how to answer. Might sound far-fetched. But don't discount the everyone else was doing it, so we had to also approach to how we arrived at some of our Jewish practices. One excellent example is Jewish views of the afterlife, which if you scour the Torah start to finish, you will find almost nothing about. Come the rabbis living amongst other religions that have very strong and well-formed opinions on that subject, and almost suddenly a literature of Jewish views of the afterlife begins to crop up and develop. The Torah seems to have almost no interest in what happens to us after we die. But the Midrash has pages of ideas on the subject, and the rabbis who wrote those were not motivated only by their own curiosity or fueled by their own powers of interpretation. They had to have an answer to this question, or their students would seek out others who did. That is not Rashi's answer for why the Torah starts with creation. His is understandable, but also one I have long found to be difficult. He says the reason the Torah has to start with God created the world is so that when nations question why the Jewish people are allowed to call the land of Israel their home, they can respond that God created the world, and so God can decide that any land belongs to any people, and God decided that Israel belongs to us. It's a little strange, and it's a little circular. God created the world, God gave us Israel, therefore Israel is ours. I'm not sure Rashi ever intended this to be used as a legal justification for our claim to the Holy Land. But he also decided to make it his very first comment. And I can only imagine that he chose his opening words at least as carefully as Dickens chose his. I am all for Israel being the eternal homeland of the Jewish people, for us to visit, support, bless, pray for, and be in deep conversation with. But if we are going to play the God card in making our claim to it, then there is nothing that stops others from doing the same. That our founding documents are usually older than theirs does not sway anyone in the God said so department. And we, the Jewish people, we have learned the hard way the notion that God changed God's mind is also a card in this problematic deck that gives theological justification to life as we wish it to be. Rashi had his reasons. I surmise that one of his reasons that he could straighten his back and stick out his chin and make such a bold claim is that no one cared. This was 1,000 years after the destruction of Israel, and it would be almost another 1,000 before a sovereign state would rise again. Rashi making a practical Jewish claim to Israel strikes me as similar to the little child who roars at the tiger from outside the tiger enclosure at the zoo. As you have noticed, the tiger does not roar back. The tiger does not care. In this scenario, in 11th century France and the centuries before and after, geopolitically, the Jews were the little child. Almost anyone else was the tiger, but without the enclosure. Make all the claims to Israel or any other kind of power you want, Rashi, you have none, and you won't for many years. Rashi's boisterous and very certain claim notwithstanding, there would later on in the Torah be another justification for Israelite and then Jewish presence in this sliver of Middle East land, which is that it would be the place where the terms of the covenant outlined in the Torah and expanded on by every generation since could be best and most fully implemented and lived out. If the people there do so, they will deserve to stay. If they don't, and turn their backs on ritual and especially on ethical mitzvot, if they become too much like other nations and focus mainly on economic success over moral behavior, on conquering rather than defending, and on failing to protect the most vulnerable among them, they would not deserve to stay and would see their time there come to a conclusion, whether temporarily or for a very long time. Historically, we know that Jews were forced out of Israel by powers greater than them. But the rabbis always attribute exile to a more teachable value than a more powerful army conquered you. They tied it to appropriate Torah-based behavior that could be lived out anywhere Jews found themselves, and still can be. Rashi's view smacks of Zionist triumphalism, which is well and good when you are 1,000 years removed from sovereignty. But now that we have it, such an approach borders on something we have to avoid at all costs, which is presuming that because Israel is now, thus it always will be. That Jewish safety and security in Israel's borders can at this point pretty much be taken for granted. We have many Jewish concerns, local, national, and worldwide, but Israel will always be at least tied for first place on the list of what the Jewish people has to concern itself with. We can never be triumphant. We can only encourage striving toward the best expression of our Israel commitments that we can implement in practical ways. One more reason that the Torah starts with creation is also one that tickles both sides of our brains. One side knows that this is our Torah, our holiest book, and to take its words with anything less than the utmost seriousness would be totally insufficient. The other tells us that we now know that the origins of the universe lie in electrochemical reactions, rapid, massive expansion, and ultimately matter settling into forms such as stars, moons, and planets. So what are we to make of our ancient ancestors' decidedly non-factual take on how everything came to be? Are we going to try to do what others have done before and show how the Torah understood the Big Bang, or physics before physics was invented, or contains all the secrets that Nobel Prize winners are still seeking to replicate in a lab or prove in a formula? Interesting as that conversation is, and there are books written on the subject, we have explored such questions in adult education at B'nai Torah before, we can assert that the Torah begins with Bereshit to stake a startling and often overlooked claim. Not to an origin story because everyone else had one, and so we needed one. Not as a Zionist polemic, as Rashi asserted, for his own good and hopeful reasons, but because whatever the technical details, the universe came into being and it was brought from chaos to astoundingly beautiful order because God wanted it to. That means it is all here for a reason. And because you are the result of God's final act of the 6 biblical days of creation, and from the Torah's account, you are the crowning achievement of God's unique, incomparable, and entirely unparalleled effort, you are here because God wants you here, to make use of your skills and talents, to love, to be loved, and to be of meaningful service to others, and to find and act on priorities and commitments we were first taught by the Torah, which we have once again just begun. Shabbat Shalom.